this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first.
Tonight, Starmer U-turns. The Labour leader says Diane Abbott is free to stand at the general election. The row over whether she'd been allowed to stand has overshadowed the campaign for another day. The Tories are claiming Starmer was bounced into changing his mind by his deputy leader, Angela Rayner. For days, we've been told that a decision was a matter for the party's National Executive Committee. But how credible is that now? I'll be asking the Shadow Scotland Secretary, Ian Murray. I'll be getting reaction too from Conservative Business Minister Kevin Hollinrake. If Labour have had a difficult few days, why haven't the Tories seen any movement in the polls yet? Plus, the party leaders here in the UK respond to Donald Trump's historic conviction, as the former president says he'll appeal. Nigel Farage says the case shows the American justice system stinks. And as radio presenter Ian Dale withdraws his bid to be a Conservative candidate after podcast comments come back to haunt him, we're talking political gaffes. All that and more with Claire Pearsall and Andrew Fisher will be with me for the next hour. It's Friday, I'm Ali Fortescue live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, before we start tonight, I want to bring you up to date with a press conference from the US. President Joe Biden, that's been happening just before we came on air. In a major announcement, he's been speaking about a new phased Middle East peace deal being put forward by Israel, which he says he hopes will achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, saying it's time for the war to end and urging Hamas to accept new proposals.
Now, after intensive diplomacy carried out by my team, my many conversations with leaders of Israel, Qatar, and Egypt, and other Middle Eastern countries, Israel has offered a comprehensive new proposal. It's a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the release of all hostages. This proposal has been transmitted by Qatar to Hamas.
Well, our US correspondent Mark Stone is here. Mark, I mean, was this a surprise?
Yes, in a word. We knew that at a low level there had been some sort of a new proposal put forward by Israel to the Qataris, who are the mediators in this, and sent to Cairo potentially. But we did not know it was of a level that would warrant the American president speaking at short notice. We only got notice a few hours ago that he would make this intervention from the White House. It's 3 phases. Let me take you through it briefly. The first phase of what he is describing as a comprehensive new proposal is a full 6-week ceasefire. It would involve the withdrawal of all Israeli forces from what President Biden says were populated areas of Gaza, the release of many, although we don't know how many, hostages in exchange for hundreds. We don't know how many Palestinian prisoners in Israel. Dead hostages would be returned as well. Palestinian civilians would be allowed to return to their homes, and humanitarian aid would surge into Gaza, enabled by the ceasefire. All that would begin immediately, would last 6 weeks, could last longer if phase 2, which would be a permanent end to hostilities, took longer than 6 weeks. The third phase would be a reconstruction of Gaza. He makes it sound so simple. I think the points to make are, first, this is very significant, potentially the most significant moment in this long conflict. There have been many before that have come and gone. This feels very significant, and sources within Gulf Arab countries who we've spoken to in the last few minutes have described it as just that, very significant. The second really important point to make is who precisely within Israel, within the Israeli government, has come up with this and who has agreed to it. We do not know that at the moment. And remember, the Israeli government is fractured. So that is something. The third point to make is, what is Hamas going to make of this? What about Yahya Sinwar? He is the Hamas leader inside Gaza, still on the run, still in hiding. The Israelis want him dead. So what happens to him? What happens to any remaining Hamas forces in Gaza? Well, President Biden made the point that he now believes we are at a point in this war where Hamas is unable to repeat what it did on October the 7th last year. And that point, that fact means that now is the time for peace. Now is the time for the day after. It was a very important intervention by President Biden, which incidentally allowed him to cast himself as a very different figure from the man who wants to be president up in New York, Donald Trump. He made a few comments about the Trump trial, but he was using this moment to be able to make these comments about the Trump trial, but then to say, forget about that. This is the important issue. And I, Joe Biden, so he says, has got a very important new proposal on the table.
OK, thank you so much, Mark. Let's speak to our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle. This is a highly significant moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, for all the reasons that Mark was just outlining. I think the issue is, and the early indications I'm getting, is that this is not a proposal that Joe Biden is putting forward with the cooperation of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that this is Biden talking to somebody else in the Israeli administration. I don't know who at the moment, but the feedback I'm getting from people close to Netanyahu is that the proposal that Joe Biden outlined in that speech was not something that they wholly recognise or agree with. And I have to say, if you look at it, there are elements of it that just do not tally with what the Netanyahu administration has been willing to concede in recent weeks. So does that mean it's more or less likely to succeed? I don't know. If it doesn't have Netanyahu's backing, then that is a major flaw to this proposal. But if it doesn't have Netanyahu's backing and it has been negotiated with somebody else, either close to the war cabinet or within the Israeli intelligence or security establishment, then that is a pretty major thing, because that would be the US president negotiating, or his team negotiating with somebody who's not the Israeli prime minister. And that has an awful lot of consequences in and of itself. I have sat here, I've been in Jerusalem, and I have reported and analysed and mulled over the prospects of multiple hostage deals over recent months, many times, and they have always failed. And they've always failed because ultimately the Israeli government and the Hamas leadership have been too far apart on what each side wants. Hamas wants or is demanding an entire end to the war, an end to the fighting, a complete ceasefire. And the Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu, is refusing to accept that, saying they need to keep fighting. And so I don't think that dynamic has changed tonight. I think that the Israeli Prime Minister and the leadership of Hamas remain entrenched in their positions, and their positions are not able to come closer together. But if Joe Biden is trying to negotiate with and put forward something that has been approved by somebody else within the Israeli administration, well, that makes for a very interesting moment.
OK, thanks so much, Ali Bunkle, with the breaking news coming out of the US this evening. OK, right, let's get back to the election campaign here in the UK then. And, well, things haven't really gone to plan for Labour this week. The days were meant to play out like this. Wednesday, they wanted to focus on the Tories' record on the NHS. Yesterday, antisocial behaviour. And today, Great British Energy. All that overshadowed, though, by internal battles. But I'll tell you the most eye-catching thing I've read today, a quote from the left-wing campaign group Momentum. If you come for the Queen, you better not miss. They're talking about the veteran MP Diane Abbott, who Keir Starmer said today is free to stand in the election. Yesterday, he said no decision had been taken. Behind the scenes, something has changed. This has gone from a week where Starmer seemed to be facing down the left of his party, showing by chance or by design how Labour's changed. Instead now, what looks like divisions with his deputy leader have been exposed, and the Tories tonight are gleefully branding Sir Keir as weak. Rows like this happen because for both parties, behind the scenes, this is a key period. Crucial decisions on who will stand as MPs in the election are being made in a hurry and in the rough and tumble of an election campaign. Entire careers and futures are suddenly being decided, but the consequences will ripple out for many years to come. Right, let's have a look at where the parties have been today. We've been hearing about Labour, but the Prime Minister has been in Greater Manchester, stopping off in Macclesfield and Bury to talk about pensions. Meanwhile, taking questions about Diane Abbott, we've been talking about that. The Labour leader, Keir Starmer, was in Glasgow, second time he's been in Scotland to launch their 6 First Steps campaign in the regions, talking about clean energy for the UK. Ed Davey decided to stay out of the water today, and instead he took up baking as a way to campaign for free school meals. He's been in Harpenden and in Wimbledon. Well, the SNP leader, John Swinney, obviously in Scotland. He's been in Glasgow to call for a Labour government to commit to an emergency budget if it gets in power. The Welsh Conservatives launched their general election campaign at a farm and clay pigeon shoot in rural Monmouthshire. And Nigel Farage and Richard Tice have been to Skegness, where Tice is standing as a candidate. And the Green Party were in the newly formed Waverley Valley constituency to talk about the lack of banking services in the area. So that's where all the parties have been, if you got through that. But the day has been dominated, of course, by that U-turn from Keir Starmer on whether Diane Abbott should stand at the election. With our roundup tonight, here's Rob Powell.
A Labour politician for decades, Diane Abbott is now free to stand for her party again. That a decision for this man, who after saying yesterday he wanted the highest quality candidates, was this morning insisting the process around Diane Abbott was ongoing.
Well, no decision has been taken, so that's the factual position.
But a few hours later...
She's free to go forward as a Labour candidate. The whip is back with her. It's been restored.
The first black female MP, Diane Abbott, was suspended after writing that Jewish, Irish and traveller people do not experience racism like black people do. She later apologised and withdrew the comments. But suggestions this week that she was to be blocked as a Labour candidate provoked a backlash, with even Starmer's second-in-command apparently straying from the party line.
I don't think there's any reason why Diane can stand as a Labour MP. Look, she's gone through a process, and that's right, and I wasn't involved in that process.
Once a shadow cabinet colleague of Sir Keir Starmer, Diane Abbott has said she'll be staying silent about her future until next week.
Some connected to Labour believe there was a course of events where Diane Abbott was let back into the party before announcing her retirement to a chorus of plaudits. Instead, the row has overshadowed campaigning and shone a light on the ability of the Labour leadership to shut down damaging stories before they start to snowball.
But this isn't the only row with the left of the party. Supporters of Faiza Shaheen are gathering in East London tonight after she was blocked from standing amid accusations of a purge of those close to the former leader Jeremy Corbyn. Rishi Sunak has had trouble with his flock too. Today, ex-Conservative MP Julian Knight said he'd be standing as an independent, branding the Prime Minister a disastrous campaigner. But on Diane Abbott, the Tories milking the row for all it's worth.
Well, I think it just reconfirms what we know about Keir Starmer, and that's that he constantly changes his mind. And it's clear that Angela Rayner's in charge of his party and not him. And if he's given into Angela Rayner on this, imagine what he'll give into when it comes to the union's demands, higher taxes, or indeed weakening our defence and security.
Since becoming leader, Sir Keir Starmer has generally won internal battles with his party. Not this time. This row may not shift the dial of the campaign, but with 5 weeks to go, it shows the favourite in this race is not immune to making mistakes. Rob Powell, Sky News in Westminster.
Well, on your screen now are all the confirmed candidates for Hackney North and Stoke Newington. Well, earlier I spoke to the Shadow Scotland Secretary, Labour's Ian Murray. Ian Murray, thanks so much for joining us. We've got to talk about Diane Abbott. I mean, the party's in a bit of a mess over this, aren't they?
Well, Keir's been pretty consistent since Wednesday. He's said that Diane Abbott had the whip back, that no decision had been made. He repeated that this morning.
Has he been consistent? He said today that she's free to stand as a Labour candidate. Yesterday, he said that no decision's been taken. That doesn't sound that consistent.
it sounds as if the decision's been made, because there was no decision made on Wednesday, none on Thursday. And in fact, Keir repeated that line to the assembled meeting
blocked
this morning. When he was asked the questions this morning about 11 o'clock, he repeated that no decision had been made, but at this stage that there was no blocking of Diane Abbott. And of course, a couple of hours later, the decision has been made to allow Diane to stand. And now, hopefully, Diane has said herself on the steps of Hackney Town Hall, I think it was on Thursday night, that she did want to retain being an MP. So we look forward to her being the candidate endorsed by the formal NEC meeting on Tuesday.
So do you expect the NEC to back her then?
Well, the NEC signs off all 650 candidates from all parts of the country. Wherever there's a Labour MP standing, the NEC signs them all off formally as part of the process. I think part of the problem we've had here is the snap election. It was called. It all took us by surprise last Wednesday, and that means that special rules come in from the NEC to take control of selections, simply because there's no time to go through formal selections through local parties, and that's the process that this has been going through.
I mean, it's made a bit of a mockery of the process, hasn't it? Now that Starmer's decided she can stand, she's allowed to stand. It's basically at his whim. Well,
I don't know if Keir's been involved in the decision-making process at all. I mean, he has said that he was glad that the whip had been restored to Diane Abbott. He's paid tribute to her as being a trailblazing MP, particularly for black women and particularly for black people in terms of becoming an MP and being that trailblazer for the last 37 years, but no decision had been made. And the press frenzy over the last 3 days about whether a decision had or had not been made, Keir has been pretty consistent on that for the last 3 days and has subsequently gone on media this afternoon when the decision had been made that she could stand again and clarified that with the media. So the frenzy around this has been extreme, but we look forward to Diane Abbott's name being on that ballot paper next to Labour Rose come the 4th of July, and if we're all victorious, look forward to welcoming back to Parliament and continue the work she continues to do so well.
What if the NEC say she can't stand?
Well, that's a decision for the NEC in terms of whether I can stand or Keir Starmer can stand and others, but it seems to me that the way the processes work, and I don't fully understand how they work, I haven't ever sat on the National Executive Committee, that they will ratify all the candidates come Tuesday.
All right, what's going on with Angela Rayner? I mean, she was at odds with the party leadership yesterday, wasn't she?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask Angela Rayner that, but the process has always been pretty clear that Diane Abbott had lost the whip for stuff that she had said. There was an independent investigation under the rules of the Labour Party. That investigation concluded. The conditions of that were fulfilled. The whip was restored. No decision had been made about Diane's candidature. The decision has now been made, and we look forward to her standing as a Labour candidate if she chooses to do so.
Why has Diane Abbott been allowed to stand and not Faiza Shaheen?
Well, again, these are decisions that are made by the National Executive Committee. As I understand it, there has been some complaints made about some tweets and other things that particular candidate has done. And it's not just about those two candidates. There have been a whole host of candidates right across the country from all sides of the party that have been denied to stand at the election because of investigations that have been pending or being ongoing. There's Lloyd Russell Moyle in Brighton. There's Graham Jones in Hydeburn, of course, from the incident in Rochdale. So we've concentrated on those two, but that's all part of a process of hundreds of candidates. I think we were nearly 40 candidates short in seats across the country when the snap election was called, and the NEC take control of those processes, and it takes some time for them to be able to come to those conclusions.
I think what some people would say is that Keir Starmer has tried to show that he's changing, detoxifying the party, and at the first bit of pressure in the campaign, he's changed his position very quickly.
Well, he hasn't changed his position. He's been perfectly consistent since Wednesday, saying that no decision had been made. It was the press that said that the decision had been made. It was Diane herself said she'd been barred from standing, and that wasn't what the understanding was that everyone had. That wasn't the case.
Come on, it has been a bit of a mess, hasn't it?
We would rather be talking about policy. We've launched our 6 steps for Scotland for the election today, a down payment on our manifesto, which includes really ambitious plans for GB Energy headquartered in Scotland. I'd rather be talking about that if I'm being completely honest. But the inner workings of the NEC is something that I'm not familiar with. But what happens when a snap election is that the National Executive Committee, the ruling committee of the Labour Party, take control of selections, but they're also responsible for making sure they sign off every candidate to stand in that election, which they will do on Tuesday. Has to happen on Tuesday, of course, because the deadline for nominations is very shortly. Postal votes will be landing on people's doorsteps within the next couple of weeks. So the election is well and truly on. And yes, I'd be rather talking about policy than talking about individuals, but this is the process that has to go through a particularly tough and difficult process when there's snap elections, as we've seen the Prime Minister call last week.
OK, let's talk about policy then. So will Great British Energy generate energy on its own?
Well, it'll do a whole host of things. It'll do everything it needs to do to meet the mission of 2030 clean energy. And it's a really exciting proposition. It'll be headquartered in Scotland. It'll be publicly owned. So any public money that's spent and any profits that are generated will be regurgitated back through for the benefit of the public. It will unleash and give a route to market for many of those big projects, including the upgrading of the grid, which is critical to making sure that we can meet our climate targets, lower bills, and give us that energy security. And critically, in terms of this process of the Green Prosperity Plan and GB Energy, is to provide that just transition away from fossil fuels that people are so desperate for. People want a plan. They want to see tangible efforts from government to show that not only can we meet this clean energy by 2030, but we can create the jobs and the careers and jobs of the future. And that's what this is all about. And it's an incredibly exciting policy that I hope people will embrace and people will vote for.
Well, that was the Labour Party. What the Conservatives made of all this. Before coming on air, I spoke to the Business Minister, Kevin Hollinrake. I want to ask you first about the story that sort of dominated the headlines. What do you think of Labour's treatment of Diane Abbott?
Well, I think it says everything about Keir Starmer, actually, that he's all over the place. He flips and then he flops. And I think as soon as he's put under pressure, he's pushed around, and he's been pushed around this time by Angela Rayner. And that's one thing. But being a Prime Minister of this country is probably the most high-pressure job in this country, and probably one of the most highest pressure in the world. And how will he cope when he's on a world stage with all the pressures that brings? So I think it says everything about Keir Starmer and many things about the Labour Party, and there's huge division within that party.
I think a lot of people would say that Rishi Sunak's been pushed around, be it on sacking Lee Anderson or Suella Braverman or various policy points. Is that a fair criticism when you're serving under Rishi Sunak?
I don't think so. I think he did what he thought was right on those occasions, and clearly people will have different views, but I think he's been very strong on these issues and very strong on other things that are really important to people, like the economy, where the economy, if you remember 18 months ago, was really suffering, predicted to go into recession, and inflation was 11.1%, and he said, we're going to sort this, and 18 months later, that's what's happened. And he's been very clear, very consistent, and he's set his stall out to deliver on those priorities, and we're in a much better place. The economy is growing, and inflation is now 2.3%. It shows you that he has got the courage of his convictions.
Yeah, but what you're talking about, is the economy on a spreadsheet. People actually don't feel better off.
Well, that's interesting, and I get that. It does take time for people to feel the benefits of it, but I've been campaigning today in my constituency. I'm talking to small businesses. They're definitely seeing an improvement in terms of their income, in terms of footfall, which would tend to indicate that people are feeling happier, but this will improve over time. We've seen 10 months now where real incomes are increasing, and that's after inflation, of course, and we're seeing taxes dropping. The average person, £900 tax reduction this year, and we'll see, hopefully, interest rates falling towards the middle of the year. So people will increasingly feel better about life and have more money to spend, which is then good for the economy, which is then a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we see better times ahead, in my view.
It just feels like, I guess I just want to know how morale is, because you have come up with some eye-catching policies, whether people like them or not, but the polls aren't changing. Why is Rishi Sunak still so unpopular?
Well, one thing we know on the doorstep is certainly there are lots of undecided people. They'll make their mind up in the weeks to come. I think those policies will have an effect. That gap will narrow. We've seen a poll recently of 12 points difference rather than the 20 points difference.
One poll.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should make sure that we look at things in a wider context. But look at the most recent full poll we've had, the local elections. There was 9-point difference between ourselves and the Labour Party. So this is closer than people give it credit for, I think. But also, we've seen in recent days, Keir Starmer shown his true colours. He's come out and said, I am a socialist. I'm an avowed socialist. And the people, I'm sure, that certainly in my constituency and others around the country who are thinking of voting for Keir Starmer will think twice on the basis of that, because that will inevitably mean, when push comes to shove, when you've got the unions pushing for more money, when you've got different people in his party pushing for more public spending, it'll be the tax lever that he grabs for, because that's what socialists do. And what we need is public sector spending restraint, which is what we will offer, and we are already seeing lower taxes and a smaller state.
Well, it's a record high tax
people have a clear choice of. Sorry.
I was saying, you talk about taxes. I mean, under the Tories, we're now looking at a record high tax burden.
Well, we've spent a huge amount over the last few years, of course, which I think most people recognise, about £500 billion to get us through COVID and the cost of living crisis, and that has to be paid for. But if you look at the way we've done that, the average earner in the UK has got a record low in terms of level of taxes, a 50-year low in terms of their taxes, lower than the US, lower than Germany, lower than France. That's how the Prime Minister's dealt with this. That's how the Chancellor's dealt with this. So for many people, taxes are lower than ever.
The IFS says income growth in the last 15 years has been the worst in generations. 15 years, that's the Tory rule.
It's been very tough, but you've got to take into account the fact those are affected by the COVID crisis and affected by the cost of living crisis. That is true, but we have turned the corner, and people will increasingly feel the benefits of that, of a growing economy, of inflation under control. Those are the things that really hit people, particularly those on low incomes.
Do you think Rishi Sunak's a popular Prime Minister?
I think he will be increasingly popular. I think he's had to take some very difficult decisions. Those things are never popular, of course, in terms of putting up taxes, as you say, to pay for the huge amount of spending we've committed to help businesses. You've got to remember back in 2020, the predictions were, at the start of the COVID crisis, predictions were 600,000 businesses going out of business. We did not see that because of the support of the COVID loans and the grants and all those things. Millions of people.
It's quite a tight time frame, though, isn't it? 5 weeks to become popular.
Yeah, listen, but we've got to make the case. And I think people will see increasingly that clear blue water between what we're saying in terms of a low-tax economy, a productive economy, and what Labour is saying, which is more spending on public services. That's what they're going to commit to. And that's going to be expensive, and that ultimately will mean black holes in their finances, £38.5 billion black hole. That's identified by the Treasury officials, not by politicians like me. That gap's got to be filled, and that's going to be about £2,000 to the average household in terms of extra taxes. That's the question they've got to answer.
Well, on the 12th of June, Sky News will be holding an election leaders event in Grimsby. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer have been invited to attend, and we're looking for a live audience to join us for the night. If you'd like to be part of this and be given the opportunity to ask a question to one of the party leaders, you can scan the QR code on your screen right now. And the latest election news is sure to feature heavily in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be Conservative Home's Deputy Editor Henry Hill and Politics Joe's political correspondent Ava Santana-Evans. Right, let's bring in our duo for the evening. We've got Andrew Fisher, former head of policy for Jeremy Corbyn, and Claire Pearsall, former Conservative advisor. Excited about this partnership. Andrew, I want to ask you first because I'm fascinated to hear what you think about what's been going on with Diane Abbott. How has she been badly treated?
Horrifically. I mean, look, we found out, I think at the beginning of this week, that instead of this ongoing independent process, actually the process had ended in December and they hadn't given the whip back. When that came out, suddenly the whip was restored to Diane and it was fine for her to be a Labour MP. But then the press were briefed by the Labour Party that she would be barred from being a candidate. They've then kind of said, oh, actually, it's up to the NEC on Tuesday for the last 48 hours, not up to me. And now today they say, actually, we've decided she is going to be a candidate and it will just be rubber stamped on Tuesday. So it's been a complete mess. They've lied, through their teeth and been exposed and, they look rather silly. And the last 3 days, I'm sure they'd deny their lie, but that would be another lie if they did. So it wouldn't do them much good. We have to be honest about these things. They have lied about this. They lied about an ongoing independent process when it clearly concluded at the end before Christmas. So it is problematic. And I think the backlash against it isn't just about, the internal wranglings between Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer at the top of the party. But do you think actually much deeper. I think that's a factor, but I think it reflects a wider thing. Look, you've had people like Lenny Henry and David Harewood coming out today backing Diane Abbott and saying how appalled they are at the treatment of Britain's first ever elected black woman MP. I think there's a lot of pressure locally. I think there were people basically saying, encouraging Diane to stand as an independent if she was blocked. I don't think the Labour Party wanted this headache, and I think they miscalculated. Leave aside the morality of it for a second about how she's been treated, but actually I think they calculated we don't need another headache taking up the campaign, because, I have to say, when you said at the beginning they were announcing something on antisocial behaviour yesterday, I missed that entirely. I saw a bit of the GB Energy stuff today, but, it's taken up the entire last 3 days, and that's not good for the party.
Is it good for the Conservative Party, Claire?
Well, of course it's good for the Conservative Party. It takes the spotlight off of the government and what they're currently doing, but it also then puts in that clear blue water between the parties, with Rishi Sunak saying, well, if you vote for Keir Starmer, this is a man who can't make a decision. So they're going to run very heavily on that. And as Andrew's just said, it has hidden all of the policy ideas that were supposed to come out. So whatever was on the grid for this week of an election campaign, just been completely buried by the misuse of the complaints system and Diane Abbott not being allowed to stand, being allowed to stand, might be being allowed to stand, whatever that message was. And I think she's been treated appallingly. Now, I don't share her politics whatsoever, but I think that as a principle, she has been treated badly. This shouldn't have taken as long, over a year of investigations. So, of course, the Conservative Party are going to go on that really, really heavily. At the moment, this is a good thing for the Conservative Party. You can point to those indecisions by Keir Starmer, another flip-flop or U-turn, whatever you want to call it. So, all in all, it's been a much better week for Rishi Sunak.
Doesn't seem to be cutting through in the polls yet, though, but we'll see. We'll come back to you in just a moment, Claire. And Andrew, right, you're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, Joe Biden has urged Hamas to accept the latest deal proposed by Hamas. We'll be speaking to Tobias Elwood.
Had a superb start to the season this year. Our Humboldt penguins are now parents to 11 healthy chicks. The first of them hatched on the 11th of April, so we were getting ready to expect a good few chicks, but we didn't really expect to have as successful a year as 11 of them. We could have named them after an entire football team if we wanted to, which would have been good fun. But no, these guys are our healthy little troop for 2024. The chicks are doing brilliantly. They've all passed the 40-day mark now. Some of the biggest of them are 3 kilos already. 2 kilos already. The parents, they are our Humboldt penguins. They are found around the coasts of Peru and Chile in the wild, and we have 40 of those guys here, and you can see them in the back behind me now. The chicks they're doing really well, and yeah, it's a great start to the season. Oh, every one of these guys here has very different personalities. Everybody's favourite, I think it goes without saying, is Hazel. She's a real character. We'll get under your feet and explore everything that's going on. Some of our younger birds, Rob and Ryan, they're quite inquisitive as well. But then you do have some of these guys who will always want to pick a fight, no matter what we do and no matter how much we're trying to help. Their natural instinct breaks out, and they can be quite spiky.
Welcome back. You're watching the Politics Hub on Sky News. The top stories tonight. Joe Biden has tonight been outlining a new ceasefire proposal to try and end the war in Gaza. We'll be getting more reaction to this in just a moment. Back here in the UK, the election campaign, Keir Starmer says Diane Abbott is free to stand for Labour at the general election, despite previously saying no decision has been made. The Conservatives, who've described Starmer as weak, have meanwhile unveiled plans for fly tippers to get points on their driving licences. And the Lib Dems announced plans for universal free school meals for primary school children. OK, let's talk a bit more about the breaking news this evening coming from the press conference which President Joe Biden held just before we came on air tonight. The US president's been outlining a new ceasefire plan to try and end the war in Gaza. He's been saying Hamas is no longer capable, as he puts it, of carrying out a repeat of October the 7th attacks, and says it's time for the war to end. Well, let's speak to the former chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Firstly, your reaction to the news out of America this evening.
Very welcome indeed. And that analysis of the threat picture of what Hamas is capable of, I think, is a very important starting point. I mean, we're well into the ninth month here. This is a complex conflict triggered by that barbaric attack on the 7th of October by Hamas. And we're never going to move forward unless America yielded its influence. Tony Blair, the US Secretary of State, and David Cameron, to be fair as well, have been working hard behind the scenes to bring all the stakeholders together to lay the foundations for a short-term workable ceasefire, to get aid in, to get the hostages free. And this three-phase plan by Israel, endorsed by Washington, is the most viable plan I've seen put on the table that has the potential to move forward. So I'm pleased that we are where we are here today. We've got 6 weeks now to allow a ceasefire to fall into place and negotiations to take place.
As you say, I mean, it's obviously a very complex situation. Do you think this could actually lead to peace?
We are a long, long way from there. We've seen how close we've come to other stakeholders becoming involved, escalation right there with Iran as well. The West's patience with the Prime Minister Netanyahu was really being tested indeed, with no obvious strategy as to how it was using its military incursions into Gaza City and indeed to Rafah. And of course, the scale of civilian casualties rightly drawing international criticism, including from the UK. But it's a humanitarian situation, I think, that became most intolerable, with famine and starvation threatening to the scale of which the international community resorted to building its own port, its own jetty to get humanitarian aid in. So this is very, very good news indeed. However, your question, we're still left with the problem of long-term governance. Hamas is still in charge of the Gaza Strip. It's still a terrorist organization. It's still embedded in its constitution, committed to annihilating Israel as a state. And of course, this other question I keep posing, behind Hamas sits Iran. Behind the Houthis sits Iran. Behind Hezbollah sits Iran. And for too long, Iran has been given free rein to do what it likes, to extend its influence over the Middle East in such a corrosive way.
Are you confident that the whole of the Israeli war cabinet actually backs this move? We heard Joe Biden urging the Israeli leadership to back it.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you raised such an important, another aspect of this, another facet of this has been the complexities of Israeli politics. The fact that this war cabinet had to be drawn together of the myriad of parties that are there, with Netanyahu at the forefront. You're absolutely right. It requires the blessing, the support of all of the Israeli parties if this is to actually move forward. And you could see politics play out in order to try and leverage for party political gain. I hope that isn't the case. I hope people see the bigger picture, see where this could escalate to, unless we're allowed for a ceasefire to embed itself. That would lead to potentially hostages being released, lead to aid getting in, lead to perhaps questions about a future governance structure, but also the reconstruction of Gaza as well.
Do you get the sense that Netanyahu might have been sidelined here?
He's, I think, very much involved here, but his future, big questions for that, but that's for the Israeli people. More importantly, is the fact, as I started to say, you needed a solution which brought together the Abrahamic Accord signatories, the Arabic countries that are neighboring. They're pivotal to this, the United States in particular, and the West and the UK as well, but Israel as a whole. This is the closest we've got. I really do hope this works.
OK, Tobias Elwood, thanks so much for joining us this Friday evening. Right, coming up next on the Politics Hub, we'll take a deep dive into Labour's plans for energy. Will they fuel investment in green projects or, as the Conservatives claim, just raise bills? Welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, one of Labour's flagship policies for this election is their plan for what they're calling GB Energy, a mechanism for investing in renewable energy. And they claim to lower bills in time. But will it work? Our latest campaign check has been underway, and here's our business correspondent, Paul Casey.
Launching a state-owned clean power company modelled on French national provider EDF and Sweden's Vattenfall, Sir Keir Starmer said Great British Energy will cut energy bills for good as families face the threat of £900 annual energy price spikes under the Tories. On the face of it, that is a worrying projection, but it's based on the recent history of soaring prices being repeated. This is the energy price cap, and Labour say that in the 2 years since the war in Ukraine began pushing up prices, consumers have paid £1,880, or about £900 a year, more than these pre-war prices, and all of that before the £94 billion of government support that limited household bills. Now, they argue that as long as the UK is a net importer of natural gas, it will remain exposed to spikes like these in future. Now, how likely that is depends on your view of global events, but Labour and the Conservatives actually agree the way to increase energy security and cut these bills is to accelerate the transition to renewable and low-carbon sources. Where they differ is how fast. Labour says the Conservatives have blocked clean, homegrown power, holding back efforts to build cheaper and more secure forms of energy. Now, this chart shows how much renewable energy capacity the UK currently has, around 15 gigawatts each of offshore and onshore wind and solar. But onshore wind, the green line, has flatlined because of government planning rules in England, and offshore wind, the blue, has stalled in the last year as a government auction round failed. Now, this is where the Conservatives say they want to get to. No increase in onshore wind, but a big increase in solar and offshore wind capacity up to 50 gigawatts. Now, Labour's wind targets, the dotted lines, they are larger and, crucially, they are faster. They want to decarbonise the grid entirely by 2030. That's 5 years before the Conservatives, just 6 years away, which everyone in industry and even Labour privately agree is massively challenging. But Keir Starmer argues that aiming for these targets will cut bills. Great British Energy says it's part of our mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower by 2030, helping families save £300 a year off their energy bills. Now, that £300 figure is contested and complicated. Renewable energy is cheaper, but only once you've paid for building the infrastructure, much of which needs subsidy. And with the electricity transition alone forecast to cost more than £100 billion, the majority of which will come from the private sector, Great British Energy, with just £8.3 billion to invest in the first term, will, in the short term at least, have a relatively small part to play.
Right, let's bring Claire and Andrew back in. Andrew, I mean, you worked on some pretty radical policies with Corbyn. Do you think there's a lack of ambition from Keir Starmer?
Well, look, in the rhetoric, getting to clean net zero by 2030 in terms of power is massively ambitious. I think, unfortunately, Great British Energy is a little bit underpowered to get there. It's the right thing to do. I just don't think it has the level of investment we're going to need to get there. And so what we've seen from Labour is they announced in 2021 £28 billion a year of green investment. They called it their Green Prosperity Plan. And the target then was 2030. Now, they've scaled that back to £6 billion a year and still say they're going to achieve the same outcome. And to me, that's just not credible. They've stripped out the home insulation package entirely, which would have created thousands of jobs, helped reduce people's bills, because if your home's insulated, you lose less energy, you don't need to put the heating on so much. And save people, create jobs, save people money, and that bit's gone. So without that and less funding behind this, it doesn't seem credible to me. But it's the right thing. We do need to put in lots more renewable energy, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, and other things. But today there's been slightly mixed messaging about this, and I've been speaking to a few Labour MPs. Because normally when they do a policy announcement, they all get a briefing sent to them. That hasn't come today. And I've seen on media today various MPs saying it's an energy company, it's an investment vehicle. They haven't quite got their lines right.
I still haven't quite worked out.
And what it seems to be, and I'm trying to cut through the kind of find a middle path and find out exactly what it is, it seems to be they're trying to lever in more investment from the private sector, which is a necessary thing. We've seen the collapse of the last round, as you showed there, of offshore wind. But on the riskier parts of things where the private sector isn't investing at the moment. So that's like floating offshore wind, carbon capture and storage, the stuff that hasn't yet been proven at scale, at least, to work. And if it's just doing that, that's got a long lead-in time with any unproven technology, trying to build it at scale. And actually, if you're going to get there by 2030, it needs to be far, far bigger than that. And I think, in reality, the structure's good, the ambition's good, the means to get there just aren't there, I'm afraid.
Yeah, as you say, do you think the Conservatives need a bit more ambition on this?
I think the Conservatives are, quite honestly, they understand what the capabilities in the United Kingdom are. Now, there are difficulties when you're looking at onshore wind farms or solar farms. The planning laws in this country make it incredibly difficult for those things to happen.
David Cameron changed those, though, didn't he, to make it virtually impossible to get any onshore wind, which is why it's flatlined for the last 10 years.
You need to put it into the hands of the local community so that it's going to affect. And I think that's only right, that local communities have a say in where these things go, because it isn't quite as simple as just saying, oh, well, you're changing those plans. I think you need to work with local communities. You can't just put something somewhere and expect it to work and expect it to go ahead. What I find really interesting with Labour's ambitions is it's not taking into account, it's been in Scotland where the oil and gas industry is enormous, and you could look at potentially 2,000 job losses if they were to come away from those traditional industries. So I think that they're going to start having a few issues with especially the unions up there, but also the people of Scotland, who are going to say quite rightly but this is what we do, this is how we're good at doing it. Why are you taking jobs away from us? You're not guaranteeing those jobs within the green sector. And also quite amusing today was when this was all launched, there was a link to the website for Great British Energy, which led you to a blank page, which I thought kind of summed up those ambitions at the moment. Yes, it is the right thing to do. I think we all agree that we need some clean energy. We need energy security. But I also think that Labour need to be really honest with the general public that this is potentially going to cost you, because not all of this is going to come from private sector funding, as you've said. Some of it will, rightly so. Not all of it. And it isn't going to make a difference on people's bills straight away. The infrastructure costs are absolutely enormous. So there is going to be a kickback on that. And I think when you look at the numbers, they're very, very complicated. And the taxpayer, the British taxpayer, is going to have to pick up the tab somewhere along the line.
I don't think that's right, because if you invest in something, you will bring bills down, because if you get cheaper, cleaner energy
but
being
not
produced,
straight away.
it won't
You are
be straight
going to
away.
have a
But
period.
Labour haven't said that, to be fair. They have said at the end of year 5, your bills will come down.
And that's what I mean about they need to be a lot more transparent, because what happens in that interim period, those bills aren't going to go up naturally, because who else is going to pay for it?
They're not, because the public sector will borrow.
Love a bit of friendly debate. We'll come back to this. But I do just want to bring you some political reaction to that Middle East peace plan revealed by Joe Biden tonight. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, has posted this on X. With a new hostage agreement on the table, Hamas must accept this deal so we can see a stop in the fighting, the hostages released and returned to their families, and a flood of humanitarian aid into Gaza. As we've long argued, a stop in the fighting can be turned into permanent peace if we're all prepared to take the right steps. Let's seize this moment and bring this conflict to an end. Well, still to come on the Politics Hub, broadcaster Ian Dale pulls out of standing as a Tory candidate in Tunbridge Wells after a recording emerged of him saying he didn't really like the place. But do you have to love a place to represent it in Parliament? We'll discuss that next.
I can give you anecdotal evidence of how high cinema prices are, which I'm sure Phil will have an opinion on. The lockdown created habits of viewing, of streaming at our convenience. We love watching TV and film on our phones. And of course, we have great television. We have alternatives. We have gyms. We have restaurants. We have lifestyle choices that we didn't have maybe 30, 40 years ago.
That global figure, of course, is made up of a whole series of different territories. For the UK, we're probably looking at even in terms of box office for this year. The industry analyst Gareth Street have indicated about 1.04 billion. Last year was 1.06. It's undoubtedly true that we knew this year would be a challenging year. We had the strikes for the actors and the screenwriters in the US, which has pushed back the production and the delivery of a large number of films, some into later this year, some into 2025. So, no one would underestimate the challenges. There are broader cost of living issues and people's ability to spend, and we'll get on to ticket prices. But I think as the year gears up, certainly into the summer, into the end of the year, for the UK sector particularly, it's a very optimistic picture.
We all grew up on going to the cinema because Tom Cruise was in a film, these big adventure stories. John Travolta, of course. I'd still go out for John Travolta. And these days, I feel like that cultural space has been replaced by pop stars. So this summer, the events are Taylor Swift coming to the UK. We've had Ed Sheeran filling Wembley Stadium. We've had the likes of Adele. We have these totemic stars who we feel are somehow, perhaps it's a myth, but they feel more authentic, that they are sharing their lives with us.
You're absolutely right that in the social space, pop stars and reality stars, etc., are filling part of that space. But that's complementary to Margot Robbie, to Tom Cruise, to Tom Hardy, to Chris Hemsworth, all those other people who do still drive movies. And, obviously, the studios and distributors are looking to create stars and for people to have resonance with audiences. But actually, it's also about the originality of the stories. So last year, of course, we had the, almost unique cultural moment of Barbie and Oppenheimer together. We have coming up Deadpool and Wolverine, which when the trailer was released was seen by 365 million people in the first 24 hours, which is a record. There is still that excitement that can be engendered around the uniqueness of the big screen experience.
Welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, the election campaign may only just be getting going, but for one hopeful, the LBC presenter Ian Dale, the race is already over. He had expressed a desire to fight the Tunbridge Wells seat for the Conservatives, but confirmed today that he was pulling out after this clip emerged of him on a podcast 2 years ago.
I've lived in Tunbridge Wells since 1997, slightly against my will, in that my partner comes from Tunbridge Wells and can't really imagine living anywhere else. I've never liked the place, still don't, and would happily live somewhere else.
Claire, do you have to like a place to represent it in Parliament?
Well, of course you do. You have to have a respect for somewhere, and you are supposed to like where you live. You've chosen to live there. And it's one of these things that it wasn't his natural home place, it was his partner, now husband. But I think that you sort of just embrace that and you say, this is now going to be where I live, and you look at all the positives. No place is absolutely perfect. I love where I live, absolutely love the little village of New Ash Green, just give it a little shout out there. There are some issues, but it is one of the best places to live, and I would be really proud to represent it, and I think that you should always be proud. If you want to stand for Parliament, represent people in that constituency, you should be proud to live there.
I mean, Andrew, you've got to wonder what they might be saying. This was public, but what they might be saying in private.
Yeah, I mean, I think most MPs do love the place they represent. I mean, a lot of them have represented it for a long time and they've grown up there. I think it's different when people are parachuted into places. Yeah. That sometimes is
Can
a
it
bit
be a
dodgy.
love-hate relationship?
You know, look, I live in Croydon and I love the place, but it, you know, it has its issues. You may have caught some of them on the news now and again, but it's a great place to live, and I love my local community as well. It's excellent. But you know, everybody has their unguarded moments. And look, in fairness to Ian, I think he tried to get into this for the right reasons. He's you know, I've been on his panel shows and is interviewed by him a few times. He's genuinely quite miffed about the way the Tory party's gone and wants to, I think, you know, introduce a bit more integrity into the party, and I think stood for the right reasons. And unfortunately, that clip came out. And in our, you know, we have a first past the post system, which is constituency based. You have to live, you know, you have to love where you live. It's not like he's on a list in a kind of PR system. Yeah, and I think he made the right decision. I think he would have been bombarded with that clip and that quote on every other party's campaign leaflet.
And I think it's a real shame, because I think he would have been a benefit in Parliament. We would have seen some really good debates happening, and I think it's a shame. I really, really do, and I hope that he comes back in the future.
Do you think he should have tried to plough on through?
No, I don't think he should. I think he made absolutely the right decision. It would have been the worst of all worlds if he'd just ploughed on and tried to get out of it by saying, oh, well, I didn't really mean it. I think that's way worse. He did the right thing, very honourably stood back.
And I was just digging out there, Amber Rudd, who was criticised previously for criticising her own constituency of Hastings. She said people prefer to be on benefits by the seaside. I don't know if you remember that. That was a bit of a moment. Right, thank you so much, both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure this evening, and for giving up your Friday evening. That is it from us tonight. It's been me for the yesterday, and me again tomorrow, and me again on Sunday. So a lovely weekend for me ahead. I will see you tomorrow at 7. The election countdown continues. Coming up next, we're going to have the UK tonight, and of course much more on the story coming out of the Middle East. But for now, from us on the Politics Hub, 33 days, 11 hours and 3 minutes to go until the general election. Very exciting times ahead here on the Politics Hub.